All right, welcome back to General Psychology, the second lecture of what's going to be three lectures on intelligence. And I'm picking up right here where I left off in the first lecture when I noted that if we look at the intelligent behavior of animals, they are all over the place, and there are lots of animals that can do things that we once thought only people could do. And there are lots of animals that are as smart as or smarter than people in particular areas and are just regular animals in other areas and can't, of course, come anywhere near approaching what people can do. Again, I'm not arguing that there are animals out there who have hidden civilizations where they invented smartphones, but I'm arguing that in particular areas like memory, for example, there are animals that outshine people. And if you just look at things like basic problem solving, there are animals that can do at least basic logic and problem solving. That's the broad point. The broader point, the broadest point, is that intelligence or genius is not a general thing you have or don't have. It's modular, it's isolated, it's specific, and we'll come back to that point later in today's lecture. All right, let's move on from animals to people because IQ tests go to people. We don't ever give parrots or Finch's IQ tests. We give them to people, and they often determine whether people get into honors programs or gifted and talented programs, whether they make it into Georgetown versus don't make it to Georgetown, make it to Harvard versus don't make it to Harvard. So we're going to talk about people a bit here, and I'm wrestling a bit with my technology, so please forgive me. One of my favorite quotations from one of my favorite artists is from Salvador Dali. He has a great museum if you ever, well, there's a great museum about his work. He died a long time ago in the St. Petersburg, Tampa, Florida area. I believe it's in St. Petersburg. I've been there twice, but it's been at least a decade and a half or 2 decades since I have been there. Anyway, amazing artist. Salvador Dali said, "A true painter is one who can paint extraordinary scenes in the middle of an empty desert." And by that, he meant if you really have the artist's eye, if you've really trained yourself and become a master artist, you can draw or paint anything anywhere. You don't need to look at a model. You know what a tiger looks like from behind and from the side. You can imagine a tiger jumping out of the mouth of a fish, chasing a gun, and you can paint that without having to put up models in your studio because you have the mind of the brilliant artist. That's his point. Well, if we accept that point as one way to define artistic genius, there can be no doubt that Richard Wowrow, who lived from the early 1950s to the mid early 2000s, you can see here, he was a Scottish artist who taught himself to draw as a very small child, beginning around the age of 3, and he produced all of his artwork, every bit of it, thousands of pieces, using nothing but wax crayons. He didn't paint, he didn't sculpt, he only drew with wax crayons. And I often find myself mistakenly saying what he painted because some of his work looks like it must have been painted, but none of it was. He did everything with wax crayons. He was easily one of the most famous and successful artists in Europe during the last 20 years or so of his life. Fans of his work range from political leaders to late popes to people who are themselves experts in art. And so there can be no doubt that as the life of an artist goes, he was very successful, and I'll show you why. I've lifted a few images here from his webpage, which I encourage you to go and explore to see more of his work. This is Barcelona, Spain in 1979. This is the island of Sicily in 1979. This is someplace in Pakistan. I can't quite read from the screen capture here. It's a little fuzzy, but someplace in Pakistan in 1977. And here are a bunch of very small samples of his work. And what I love about his work is the emotional nature of his work, the fact that he does great things with light and wind and clouds. He makes me feel like I'm there. So if I look at some of his work, if I want to be a critic and be obnoxious, I could say, well, those birds don't look that technically accurate. He didn't get the bill just right. There's something a little off. But he does create the feeling of being there. And he's, again, particularly good, I think, with light and wind and clouds. So those are some of the things that stand out to me about his work. As I look at this tree right here, I feel like I can feel the wind blowing and I'm there. Maybe it's some lake in California. Who knows where it is, but it's some beautiful place. Now, he did most of his drawings, by the way, from photographs. So he didn't travel that much, but he loved to look at travel books and photographs, and he would look at a photograph today and sort of tuck it away and maybe decide to make a drawing of it a month later, a year later, sometimes a decade later. All right, here's one of my favorite pieces I'm sharing with you in a bit more detail. And what I love about this piece, I assume this is someplace in Central or South America, it could be other places, is that I feel like I'm there. I feel like the clouds are coming in over the mountain. It's early morning, maybe it's late evening. I feel like I'm in that place. So that's something he was really great at. All right, let me share with you a couple more quick images of his work and tell you that he sold over 1,000 drawings and made many, many more. He could remember every detail of making each drawing, including the exact date when he rendered it. I'm sure someone wrote it on the back of the work as well, but he could tell you, I made that drawing on August 11th, 1978, and he could tell you where. So he had an amazing memory for when he did the work. He did not need to work from models or photos as many good artists do. He would look at an image once, make a drawing of it a year later if he wanted to. He could change it if he wanted to. So to amend Dali's quotation a bit here, a true artist is one who can create extraordinary scenes in the middle of an empty desert with nothing but some crayons. Nothing but some crayons. All right. So returning to Richard Wowrow and his work, part of what makes his work interesting is his life story. His skill became apparent when he was 3 years of age, and at first his parents actually discouraged him from drawing. Eventually they realized how important it was to him and encouraged him. It did blossom over time. He had very serious physical and visual disabilities that made it very hard for him to work. And I'll show you that in just a minute. At the age of 3, he was diagnosed as moderately to severely retarded. And in fact, that was not a correct diagnosis. He was autistic, but his autism did have a big effect on his life. It meant, for example, that he did not develop functional language until he was 11. And even as a young adult, he had great difficulty speaking. So if you gave him a standard IQ test, obviously he would not do well. And yet he had this area of amazing genius. I'm going to share with you just a brief clip of him at work. It's pretty low quality. I apologize. It's the best thing I could find, but I'm going to share with you a brief clip of him at work so you can see what he looked like when he was doing his amazing drawings. All right, what I've done here is I picked up a video of Wowrow at work, and I'm having a bit of computer trouble, so things are glitching. I hope it won't glitch while I try to show you what it looks like while he's working. Basically what you're going to see is a person doing a documentary about him who gave him a giant piece of paper, something like a 3-foot by 4-foot sheet of paper, and he had his crayons with him. So they wanted to know what would happen if you gave him the biggest sheet of paper they could find. And you'll see is that he can't resist immediately jumping into making a drawing that he will work on for hours and hours and hours through the night until he's done. You'll also see that he has difficulty seeing as he has to get really close to the crayons to pick one out. So let's see if we can get this to work. Just a second here. There we go. He always worked a few inches away from the work, and then we'd back up to get a sense of the whole piece. Now this, I think, is the finished work. And when he did that, he would polish it with a soft cloth that gave it sort of a shine, made it look more like a photograph than a drawing. But in a moment here, you're going to see him being given a giant sheet of paper to see what he'll do with it. This is a celebration. When he finished the drawing, he'd have a little celebration with his dad. I think his dad's speaking Polish here, although you don't have any audio for that. So he, was very, very excited when he finished a piece of work, and it was like he'd won some big championship fight every time. Now I think you're going to get to see him work on the big piece. Now they're going to take this over the city, so I'm going to pause it a bit. All right, my apologies. In the interest of time, I skipped a little bit of the video here. We went on a tour of the city and you saw some of the things that he had drawn, and so I don't think we need to focus on that too much. I'm going to show you here again with him at work in front of a big piece of paper what happened just like that when he got a big piece of paper that he wasn't expecting. Okay, so far I could do that. So far you could. He's drawing a mountain. Okay, nothing special so far. Okay, one mountain behind another. And then you're going to see him go to work. He's deciding there where to put the sun or the moon. I think it's the sun. I think it's going to be shining through some clouds, but he works and works for many hours at this. He would work through without taking a bathroom break or a break to eat if you let him. His parents who cared for him often had to stop him from working, so he worked through the night into the next morning, which most of us would not do unless we had some pressing deadline. He did it because he couldn't stop doing it unless somebody stopped him. He's still not done to work in the next day. And I'm going to skip forward here a little bit if you don't mind. Maybe just skip ahead about a minute. Getting closer, getting closer. Now you're starting to see there's a mountain there and a sun and some clouds, and I think I'll let you see a little bit more of it. But notice he covered up he drew three mountains in great detail and then virtually covered them in clouds. It's more like he made a sculpture than a drawing. So the important point there is that he makes the drawing and he has his usual celebration. And if you were to catch him a year later, he could tell you the exact day. In this case, it might be 2 days because he probably started at 10 o'clock and finished at, let's say, 10 o'clock the next day. He could tell you the exact date on which he rendered a drawing, and he could tell you that on for any drawing that he ever produced. So he had an amazing memory for images and a memory for dates when he created images. Okay, that's Richard Wowrow. I know I zipped through that pretty quickly, but I hope you can appreciate his amazing genius in the area of drawing. I wonder if you could guess how good he was at sculpting or painting or even drawing with a pencil. I assume he could draw a bit with a pencil if you could convince him to do it. But if you looked at his performance in other areas of art, he just couldn't do it. He couldn't produce a sculpture. His talent was unique to drawing, and in fact, in his particular case, drawing with crayons. He did have one other amazing talent, which was he was a phenom when it came to baseball knowledge. So he knew now this guy lived in Scotland. He wasn't he never was surrounded by Americans. He had an amazing, deep, rich knowledge of baseball. So he was a savant. We'll get to that term in just a minute in two different areas, particularly in art and also in his insanely rich knowledge of this weird American sport called baseball. All right, that's Richard Wowrow. Let me share with you, or try to share with you, another savant. This is Alonzo Clemens. He's a sculptor, and I'm happy to say he's still alive today. He developed incredible sculpting abilities, also without any formal instruction. So you see him here a couple of decades ago as a pretty young man working on a giant sculpture of a galloping horse. You see those two elephants. You see him saying hello to some dolphins. You see that amazing sculpture of a group of dolphins. If I could share with you, excuse me, a little bit more of his work, you can see that he created that life-size bronze sculpture in 3 weeks. Now, he did not do the bronze work. That's a set of particular technical skills that other people have that he does not have. So he didn't pour liquid metal, but he made these three gigantic horses galloping in about 3 weeks, and he could create a smaller piece, say a piece a foot long by in a little bit less than that, in 15 or 20 minutes. And you'll get a chance to see him at work in just a second. He could do all of this from memory. So many sculptors, even professional sculptors, like to work from a model, a series of photographs, an actual model of a physical object in the room. Alonzo could do this from memory, and I'm going to show you a quick video of him at work. All right, here's your short introduction to Alonzo Clemens.
Alonzo Clemens from Boulder in Colorado doesn't experience stage fright either. He doesn't even know what it is. As long as you let him do what he can do best, he's the happiest man on earth. Within only a few minutes, he can mold perfect animal sculptures out of any piece of clay, tar, or wax. Incidentally, we brought Alonzo to a horse farm in his neighborhood, only to let us, and you, see how accurate his clay animals are. Alonzo himself doesn't actually need a model. In this respect, he is a genius. Alonzo shapes his figures without even glancing at the horses. But when it comes to shaping his sentence, Alonzo faces huge problems.
What happened to Alonzo is when he was a young boy, maybe 2 or 3 years old, he had a bad accident in which he fell on his head. That accident caused severe injury to his brain.
Alonzo's brain never really recovered from this accident. He can neither read nor write, nor can he calculate, and he will never drive a car. Only his friends can understand him when he speaks, and Alonzo doesn't speak much. But he has taken part in the Special Olympics as a weightlifter. After years of being institutionalized, Alonzo now has a part-time job and a flat of his own. And he shapes animal figures, thousands of them. Each of them is absolutely perfect. Alonzo knows most of these animals only from books.
I'm going to pause it here. I'm trying not to jump in too much, but one of the things that's not so perfect about the images you see here, there is one thing that's not perfect, and I'll just cut to the chase. It's the cowboy. The cowboy is a bit cartoonish. Alonzo did not begin sculpting people until later in his sculpting career, and I've kept up with his career. I think he's gotten better at people, but he's still much better at sculpting animals than at people, and he probably always will be. I should also mention I've communicated with his caregiver a bit, and she has noted that his linguistic capabilities, his ability to speak, has increased a lot in his middle age years, so he can communicate better now than you could see him communicate in this video. But he still, of course, will never drive a car. He still has intellectual disabilities, and yet he produces this amazing work of sculpture. And not only can he do it, he can do it from memory, and he can do it very, very quickly. Now, a couple of things they're going to say here are not quite technically correct, but I'm going to let them speak and tell you about what they think about his amazing abilities. Right.
One of the most intriguing talents of some savants is their ability to immediately transform every photograph into a 3D figure. Experts now believe that we all have similar talents, but that they have become overlaid by more complex abilities, such as language.
That's not quite true, but okay, that's his.
What horse is it?
A wild horse, right?
It's a wild horse, a Mustang.
Yeah.
Okay. For the last year, he's been very interested in doing sculptures that have both an animal and a person. What is fascinating to me about this is that his savant chip or wiring in his brain that works so wonderfully when it comes to his animal sculptures is simply not there for the human form.
So far, there is no single theory that explains the amazing talents of all savants, because not everybody with injuries to the left hemisphere develops similar magical skills as Alonzo's. He is one of only 100 prodigious savants worldwide. He is not able to sculpt animals, he is compelled by his brain.
With Alonzo Clemens, when he was in a residential facility, they took his play away for a period of time and said, now look, you got to learn how to comb your hair and tie your shoes. And when you do that, then they'll give you your playback.
In the dorm where he lived, there were windows that had panes of glass, and sometimes the pane would get broken. He was so observant, he knew that pretty soon the maintenance man would be coming along, removing the broken glass, putting in a new pane, and all around the edges of that would be putting glazing or putty. As soon as the maintenance man was gone, there was Alonzo scraping off that putty so he could use it to sculpt with.
All right, so that was Alonzo at work. And again, what's amazing about his work is that he can do he can create these sculptures of animals in motion by looking at a single photograph of an animal. Instead of walking around the animal and carefully studying it, he sees an animal and he seems to instantly memorize all the detailed features of the animal's anatomy, which allows him to create the sculpture a month later, a year later, anytime he wants to. Now, if you give Alonzo a piece of paper and ask him to draw, his drawings look like the drawings of a little kid. He doesn't have that skill when it comes to drawing. His genius is unique. It's modular, you could say. It's specific to sculpture. All right, so to amend Dolly's quotation again, a true sculptor is one who can sculpt extraordinary objects in the middle of an empty desert with nothing but some wax or clay, and who feels compelled to do it even if they're instructed not to. I would add that little detail. All right. There's also Derek Parvicini. You might think savantism, the ability to be amazing at something when you have a serious disability. Maybe it only applies to art for some reason. It also applies to music. Derek Parvicini is blind, autistic, and an amazing musical genius. So let's hear a little bit about his story. All right, here's Derek.
Your turn. My turn.
25 years after Derek shoved him off his piano stool, Adam continues to work with Derek weekly. He's written a book about him, helped him put out a CD, and tried to give him all the opportunities he'd have as an artist were it not for his disabilities. Last year, Adam felt Derek was ready to do something that once seemed unimaginable, to headline his own full-length concert with an orchestra on a major London stage. It was a sellout crowd. The featured piece in the performance was Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue, a challenging piece for any pianist. Not to mention one who is blind and needs to handle intricate back and forths with the orchestra without the benefit of seeing the conductor.
You could almost physically sense the connection between him and the orchestra and the audience. The immense musicality and the power of his musical communication was just fantastic.
And you think he's aware of that?
I think Derek's learning about emotion through music, which of course is the reverse way around for most of us.
And as we have discovered with Derek, there's always something more. Tonight he was performer and, with a little help from the audience, composer.
First note.
A C.
Second note. A B flat.
Derek offered to create an original piece of music on the spot from 3 notes called out at random.
So we've got C, B flat, F sharp.
F sharp.
You do a blues on that?
Can do a blues on that.
He's really improvising and he's truly creative. I mean, because you think of people with brain disorders, that there's a lot of rote involved.
Derek undoubtedly is improvising and truly creative. What's happened in the last 5 or 6 years is that his authentic voice has come through.
It's almost a signature. You know it's Derek.
I'm going to pause it because we're going to skip the other details, but the most important thing I think in this video of Derek Parvicini is not just that he's an amazing musical savant, but that he can create novel pieces. So even in the early days when people studied savants, the criticism was, well, they can copy, they can reproduce what other people make, but they can't make anything original. Like if they see a dog, they can make a sculpture or drawing of that dog as it sits in the photo, but they can't improvise. They can't create a new novel piece of music, for example. And people like Richard Wowrow and Derek Parvicini have just shown that that's not the case. What you see with them, which is what you see with regular people without disabilities who become geniuses at something, is that it takes them a while to become an active producer who's creative. They begin by copying. They begin by doing what they've seen others do. But over the course of many years of practice, they often reach a point where they can creatively produce things that no one has ever produced before. So it's not correct that savants can only copy and mimic what others do. They can create their own novel works that show true originality and creativity. All right, that's Derek Parvicini. All right, that's Derek Parvicini, as you just heard. And now we're going to hear about, let's see if I can get this to advance. I wish I were more of a genius at getting my images to advance. There we go. A famous prodigy or savant. Most people call this guy a savant too. Sometimes I think of him as a prodigy because he does have autism, but it's a relatively mild case. And he does, for example, have a sense of humor. He uses language really well. In fact, he speaks multiple languages. So we can debate whether he's a prodigy or a savant, but most people consider him a savant. He calls himself a savant because he does have a disability. It's autism, and yet he has an amazing set of a couple of areas of genius. That's Daniel Tammet, and we're going to hear his story too. All right, here's Daniel Tammet. I've forwarded the video just a bit to get you to the part that I want to emphasize.
Daniel Tammet claims that since he was 4 years old, he's been able to do huge calculations in his head. So, in August 2002, we dropped by, armed with a calculator.
And you can't see this calculator that I've got here, can you?
We first asked Daniel to multiply 37 by itself, 4 times.
Okay.
37 to the power of 4. 1 million.
Yeah.
874,161.
Amazing. Just to make sure that people say, well, perhaps you just know a few of these off by heart, let me just choose another one.
Next, we asked him to divide 13 by 97.
0.1340206.
That's as far as my calculator goes. Brilliant.
185 567.
You're carrying on.
Carrying on. Do you want me to stop or?
How many points can you do it to?
100, nearly 100.
At this point, we borrowed a computer that gave us the answer to 32 decimal places.
Okay, 0.1340206185567.
As he went on, every single number was correct. And he even surpassed the computer.
4, 6.
The computer could keep going. Computers are good at that. But if they stopped at 32
17525.
You've reached the end of the computer. It's all 100% amazing. When you're pointing to the table and doing shapes with your fingers, what's going on there?
I'm seeing the numbers, but I'm not seeing them in straight. I'm seeing pictures, shapes and patterns. Almost like a square, like the texture of water, drops, ripples almost, like something reflective. It's something you can look for, almost metallic, like gold with a half cloud, a bit like a flash.
It sounds preposterous. But if it's true, it blows away scientific theory. Daniel's...
It actually doesn't completely blow away scientific theory. Maybe it did almost 20 years ago when I made this video, but it's consistent with at least one scientific theory I'll get to later in the lecture. It's the theory of deliberate practice. But let me mention, in the case of Daniel Tammet, because his story goes on and on here, you're welcome to look it up and read about his whole life story and all the amazing things he's done. But for example, he can look at a chessboard for a second or two and then recreate that chessboard. So he has an amazing memory for at least physical objects like that. He is fluent in something like 11 languages, so he's very, very, very good at language. In fact, as part of the show, I think you see here, part of the documentary, he went to Iceland and spent a week there speaking no Icelandic whatsoever. Apparently, it's a very difficult language to learn because it's different than other Indo-European languages, or so I'm told. And in a week, he did a national interview on TV in Iceland and was able to answer basic questions. I don't think he was fully fluent, but in a week, he could get by speaking Icelandic. Okay, so he has these amazing abilities, most of which are mathematical. One other quick demonstration, he memorized, I think it was 21,000, about 20,000 decimals of pi in a very short period, and demonstrated that to people with a group of people with books of pi, page after page after page, and it took him more than 5 hours to recite it, and he did it without making a single mistake. So there's no doubt that he has a form of mathematical genius. Now that doesn't guarantee he'll be good at calculus necessarily, but I suspect he could be if he wanted to be. But there's no doubt that he has a disability, autism, and on top of that disability has 2 or 3 areas, at least language and numbers, that just put him off the charts in his skill level. He's also written a few books, by the way, which is pretty easy for him because he's a very good writer. So that is Daniel Tammet in a nutshell. And after hearing about Daniel Tammet, we're going to hear about a person who's not a savant. Again, there's controversy or debate about whether Tammet is a prodigy or a savant. Let's say he's a savant because he refers to himself that way. He does have a disability. A person who does not have a disability, at least not a mental disability, not a cognitive disability, is a kid here you're going to learn about, and his name is Ben. And Ben Underwood is the boy who could see without eyes. I can't resist telling you a brief story about him. I have a relative who told me about him before I heard about him, and they contacted me and said, "Hey, Brent, you got to hear about, there's this boy, he can see, and he ain't got no eyes." And let's just say the person who told me the story did not have always the best credibility in my eyes, I guess small pun intended. And so I said, okay, I'll check it out, but that's impossible. Let me check it out. So you're going to see very quickly in this video that Ben Underwood could, in a very real sense, see, I'm using the word broadly, without eyes, and you will see for sure that he was not faking his blindness. Let's take a look at Ben Underwood, a prodigy, not a savant. Okay, again, this is Ben Underwood, the prodigy, a regular kid with a regular IQ, probably bright normal, but who has an area of insane genius. And the very first few seconds of this image, some people find a little bit gross, but there's nothing horrible happening. I'm just alerting you to that. So this is Ben Underwood. You're going to see right off the bat how we know that he truly is blind and yet can navigate the world as if he has vision.
Ben Underwood is blind.
He's definitely blind.
Both eyes were removed when he was 3, leaving him with no vision at all. So how on earth does Ben do this? And this? And even this?
I don't think I've ever come across somebody like Ben. He was quite unique.
Ben lost his eyes to cancer, but unbelievably, he's taught himself to see with sound.
If he chooses to go out there and ride that bicycle, Let him ride the bicycle. It's got to be very smart. Somewhere in there, it's a little genius going on.
I don't consider myself bored. Ain't nothing wrong with me.
Ben has no guide dog and never uses a white cane. He's not even using his hands. Instead, he sees with sound. He makes a sharp click which bounces back off nearby objects. Amazingly, Ben's ears pick up the echoes and he can precisely locate where things are. Ben is the only person in the world who sees using nothing but echolocation.
Well, I've been able to tell.
To mention just briefly, Ben sadly passed away not that long ago of the same cancer that took his eyes when he was very young. But in the days since he became very well known, a couple of people have taught themselves with the help of others echolocation. So when he died, I don't think he was the only person on earth who learned that. But the most interesting thing about his case is he invented that. He taught it to himself. Nobody came and said, hey, let's try this amazing therapy. As a very small child, he started to pay attention to echoes, and he developed a system of echolocation, not as good as that dolphins have, obviously, because they evolved over millions of years to be amazing at it, but he can use echolocation to navigate his world, and I'll show you a little bit more of his story.
Where walls are and where things on the ground are. If I click down, then I can hear them easier. But if I'm walking, I'm just clicking over it, it's not going to get it. And I can tell where desks are in the classroom and stuff like that. I can hear the wall over there, the couch over there. I can hear the wall behind me. I can hear the wall over there and the TV and the computer. Yep.
Ben, I need a towel for drying because I don't have all my kitchen towels in here. I'm not going to get it.
Ben's echolocation is so good that at home his mum, Aquanetta, Uncle Kerry, and brother Isaiah make no allowances for his blindness at all.
When I was a little kid, I didn't really know he was blind. I just knew he was my brother.
He's determined to do what he's going to do. And he refuses for somebody to label him as blind. You see this kid that has a whole different way of thinking. It's magic and it's real.
I don't think I've ever seen anyone quite as remarkable as Ben.
If you want to keep watching Ben's story, which you can easily Google, of course, you will see that he's been tested in the lab to see the resolution. And the level of resolution of his vision is if you put something like a pencil or a magic marker on a desktop, he can tell you it's there. But if you put a matchstick on the table, of course, he can't detect something that's wrong. So, of course, he can't see everything that people with intact vision see. He can't appreciate a sunset because nothing bounces back. The limits of his vision are the limits of his sophisticated system of developing and figuring out echolocation. But the genius behind that is that he invented that as a little kid. In fact, as a little kid, as a preschooler, he was driving for with his mother, not long after his eyes had been surgically removed. And he said, Mom, when did all the tall buildings get here? According to her report. And what he was noticing was when the car had been driving in a more rural area, there were just trees. But once they got into a more densely populated area, he could hear the noise from the car bouncing off the buildings. And he made the inference that there were buildings and where they were. And from that, he built that up into a sophisticated system of echolocation. Now, he is a prodigy, not a savant. He has a visual disability, obviously, but on top of that, on top of his lack of any cognitive disability, he's a bright, normal kid. He has this amazing singular area of extreme genius. So that, I would say, qualifies him as a prodigy, not a savant. But I have one more case study for you, and this case study is meant to set a certain contrast. I mean, there are lots of these folks. There are about 100 prodigious savants and many, many, many prodigies, millions of prodigies the planet over. Some of you are prodigies at something. Many of you know prodigies. So a regular person who's really good at something in a particular area is a prodigy. The next person whose story I'm going to share with you I guess I'll make you decide if that person is a savant or a prodigy by talking about Ben Pilgrim, who's also a self-taught artist. Now, when he was a baby, his mother was quite confident for a window and was worried that he was intellectually disabled. Luckily, that is not the case. So he scores above average on IQ tests. So he can't be a savant. I'm going to show you a sample of some of his sculpture, and you can decide, though, if he's a prodigy. All right? This is some of his work. And now maybe contrast this work with the work of Alonzo Clemens, who obviously is a savant who can do that work pretty quickly. One thing that I will mention that's true of Pilgrim that's not true of Clemens is that he does all the coloring on his own artwork. He can work in multiple media. So, for example, this giraffe here is made out of clay. It's not painted. It's made out of clay. And the rhino you see here in the front is cast out of metal, and Pilgrim did the casting himself. So apparently that's one of his new things, is casting metal. That means his skill set is wider than that of Alonzo Clemens. But as I show you some of his work, you can see that he doesn't have the realistic flair for detail that Clemens has. On the other hand, he can make things that are cartoonish that Clemens would never want to make. He can work with color. So he's not the same artist Clemens is when it comes to realistic detail, but he does have a certain kind of creativity that Clemens didn't illustrate. He can also work in wood. Apparently, this looks to be a solar system. All right. He, again, can work in color. His favorite thing to do, apparently, is cartoon characters. So if you know Bob and Larry, you know that this, I think, is a synthetic clay Bob and a paper mache Larry. Also, Larry must be painted then if he's paper mache. So again, this artist can work in multiple media, but the difference between him and Alonzo Clemens is I happen to know, this is my favorite piece of his, I happen to know it took him about a week, 4 or 5 days at least of very intensive effort, looking at models, looking at plastic toys, looking at photographs here others had taken at the National Zoo. This was not something he threw together in 20 minutes, which is what Alonzo Clemens can do. This is something that took him many, many days of intensive labor. So he's not the artist that Alonzo Clemens is, even though he can do some things, of course, that Clemens can't do. So to amend Dolly's quotation another time, if you don't mind my being a little bit insulting, a mediocre sculptor is one who can sculpt decent animals or cartoon characters after studying images of the characters for many, many hours. He just doesn't have what Dolly said it takes, at least not yet, to be a genius. And Alonzo Clemens and Richard Wowrow, of course, did have that. But Ben Pilgrim can do lots of things that savants can't do, because Ben Pilgrim does not have a major intellectual disability. So, for example, I happen to know that he recently installed his own dishwasher. He can easily tie his own shoes, which some people who are savants cannot do. He, of course, can drive a car. He apparently can play Monopoly with kids who are 10 without getting into massive arguments, which I consider if you can play Monopoly with kids who are 10 and not argue, that's pretty amazing. I'm being a little bit facetious, of course. The point is that Ben Pilgrim is very smart relative to people with profound disabilities, but his sculpture is way less impressive than the sculpture of Alonzo Clemens. He just can't do what Alonzo Clemens can do, despite the fact that he's worked pretty hard at it. My guess, though, is if he worked harder, longer, maybe he would someday get to where Clemens is, but he's not there yet. And if you think I'm being a bit tough on Ben Pilgrim, let me tell you, I'm allowed to be tough on him because I am Ben Pilgrim. Now, that's a much younger version of me than you see now. That's me in my early 40s. I hope you can tell it's still me. But I am Ben Pilgrim. I chose that pseudonym to distract you and mislead you a bit. But I have long been interested in art. I've taken one college course in art. I actually didn't quite finish it. Now I remember I dropped it. I didn't like my instructor. But I'm a self-taught artist. I love all kinds of art. I love sculpting, drawing, painting. The area that I enjoy the most is sculpture. But I've not put in my hours yet to be where Alonzo Clemens is. I suspect that if I committed my life to being a good sculptor, and so could you, by the way, I could get close to where Alonzo Clemens is. That's a hypothetical question right now, but later on, I'll get the research by Kay Anders Erickson that suggests that practically anybody who puts in the right kind of very, very careful work into something can become as good as Alonzo or Walro, or at least they can approach it. So that's an example of a person who's not a savant or a prodigy, just a decent artist who put in a moderate amount of work at becoming that. Okay. Worldwide, there are about 100 people who are productive savants. My guess is there are several hundred, many who just haven't been identified by Western scientists, but worldwide, this is a very, very rare thing. Productive savants are not all over the place. They're very, very unusual people. There are millions, maybe hundreds of millions of prodigies across the globe, because a prodigy is a regular person who scores in the normal to bright normal range on an IQ test, who has pockets of isolated genius or extreme talent, extreme skill in one specific area. So Einstein was a prodigy in physics and mathematics. He wasn't good, apparently, a lot of day-to-day things. An amazing world-class athlete is very, very good at their chosen sport, like gymnastics or basketball. They would be a prodigy, not a savant. If they have a severe disability, now they would become a savant. So that's the key defining feature, the key difference. But notice, both savants and prodigies make the point that genius is not just one thing that you have or you don't. If that were the case, Einstein would have also have been an artistic genius and a musical genius and a chess playing genius and all those things. He was genius at science. And in fact, his particular branch of science, that didn't make him good at biology, for example. He was really, really, really good at physics. And my guess is had only the most basic, decent knowledge of something like biology. All right, so what's the point? Savants possess gifts that they've developed and nurtured that are normally taken as signs of genius, in combination, of course, with profound disabilities. And prodigies are regular people without profound disabilities who make the same point about IQ, I think, in a subtler way. Genius is much, much more limited and insulated, isolated. It's much more modular than we tend to assume. And I'll give you a couple more examples of that to round out this lecture. Most of the examples I've given you so far involve savants. What about prodigies? What about people who are bright, maybe even very bright or regular in IQ? They don't have a disability at all, and they're very good at something. Well, let's look at one of the most famous categories of people who are prodigies. Let's look at world-class chess players, chess masters, and you'll see that the same logic I've been describing to you also applies to world-class chess players. Chase and Simon did a bunch of classic studies of people who are world-class chess players, chess masters. They would show them an image like the one that you see here. It's labeled 1 through 8 and A through H, and I guess that's what chess players do to label a chessboard. So G1, I'm guessing that I'm touching point G1, space G1. I don't play chess, and you can see that H8 doesn't have a piece in it. So I hope I'm saying that right. I don't play chess, but they showed people a chessboard, and then they let people look at the chessboard for 5 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Bam, you're done. The chessboard disappears. And they did this with both chess masters and college students, and they just asked people to reproduce what they had seen. They gave them a blank chessboard where they could label all the pieces. And what they found, and you won't be too surprised by this because these were world-class chess players, the chess masters did way better than the students. In fact, some of them remembered every single piece on every single board, down to the last pawn in the last not so important location. They could tell you exactly where every piece on the board was after looking at it for 5 seconds, not 5 minutes, not 1 minute, 5 seconds they had it. The average college student could remember about 8 pieces, the average chess master 28. Remember, the greatest number of pieces that can be out there is 32, and some of these boards had missing pieces, so the chess masters had practically perfect memory. The college students had very poor memory. Okay, so far I just validated, Chase and Simon just showed that most people are right about chess masters. They're geniuses. They're amazing. They're the poster boys and poster girls of genius. So yeah, they probably have photographic memories. Not quite. Chase and Simon had a very interesting control condition in their study where they made an additional comparison. And in this additional comparison, they put the pieces on the chessboard not the way they would appear in a game, but at random. Any piece could go any place. It didn't have to be legal. In fact, there are some places where certain pieces can't be in a chessboard. Even I know that. I probably played chess 10 or 12 times in my life, and I know that the white pieces and the black pieces start in certain locations, and they can only go certain ways. So they put the pieces on the board at random, gave people exactly the same 5-second memory measure, and here is what they found. If you look over here at the random positions, you can see that neither the college students nor the chess masters did well at all. In fact, they remembered on average in this specific study, they replicated this many times. Other people have replicated it. When you put the pieces down at random, both the students and the chess masters perform abysmally. They get about 6 pieces correct. And notice in this study that chess masters were not 1 speck better than the college students, because the knowledge they have, the rich knowledge structure they have for the game of chess, no longer benefited them. So chess masters are not people who are born with photographic memories or amazing logical thinking skills. They're people who spend many thousands of hours, often with coaching and practice and lots of tournament play, getting good at the particular activity we call chess. All right, one other quick detail. If you ever get a chance to read Kay Anders Ericsson's book, it's by Anderson and Poole actually, called Peak. Read that book. In that book, for example, he talks about a famous study done recently of chess masters or very, very good chess players, where they followed a group of kids longitudinally. They gave the kids all kinds of measures, including standard official IQ tests. And if you follow the kids over time, the kids who became the best players out of this group of amazing kids were not the kids with the highest IQs. In fact, if you took the kids who became the very, very best at chess, they had lower IQs on average than the players who became good but not super good chess players. So having a good IQ at age 10 does not predict becoming a good chess player later in life. Right, that's Chase and Simon. The guy, Kay Anders Ericsson, that I just mentioned, has done dozens, if not hundreds of studies now in his 30-ish or 30, I'm going to say 30 plus year career. To stop there because he actually passed away about a month ago. So in his early 60s, I think it was, he passed away, died pretty young. In his career, most of it's been at Florida State University, I think. He just did study after study after study that showed that to be able to perform like a genius at just about anything, whether it's basketball or the violin or any intellectual activity, requires you to put in thousands of hours, what he called deliberate practice. Not just practice, it's deliberate practice. That's practice done with the serious goal of improving your skill and or performance level over a lengthy window of time. It requires dedication. It requires a person who really loves what they do, or at least a parent who strongly pushes them in that direction. Without deliberate practice, according to Kay Anders Ericsson, nobody becomes really good at anything, at least anything that has a big intellectual component. Now, I know researchers who've argued with him over questions like whether basic strength or speed require deliberate practice. My hunch is probably not, but even there's room for argument, but certainly anything complicated. And playing basketball, by the way, is really complicated. Playing the violin is really complicated. Painting is really complicated. Anything that requires sophisticated skill set, not just picking something up. In fact, things that look simple like running also involve a lot more skills than you might think. But deliberate practice, according to Kay Anders Ericsson, in a complicated activity, whether it's physics or whether it's being a really, really, really good typist, that requires deliberate practice. There's debate about exactly what the magic number is for every activity, but Anders Ericsson's work shows in a pretty obvious way that the more complicated the activity, the more hours of deliberate practice. So you could probably become very good at playing the harmonica in, let's say, 1,000 hours practice. That's about a year at 20 hours a week, or 2 or 3 years at maybe 8 or 10 hours a week. But if you want to become a world-class violinist or the best harmonica player in the state or in the nation, it would take a lot more practice than that. So of course, the number of hours matters. That's what Kay Anders Ericsson's research shows. And of course, for something really complicated like physics, or even psychology. It takes more practice to become a prodigy or an expert in psychology than it takes to become an expert, let's say, at throwing darts. Throwing darts is a relatively simple thing. I don't want to make it sound super easy, but you could probably become a very, very good dart player in a few hundred hours of very careful practice. It's got to be deliberate practice, but you could not become an amazing psychologist in a few hundred hours. You can pass this course and get an A in a few hundred hours, but if you want to become a world-class psychologist, that's going to take many, many thousands of hours of work. All right, so Thomas Edison and the other people he probably stole this quotation from, and blanking on the name, the person who actually probably came up with it first. I think her first name was Mary. Thomas Edison and the people he stole this quotation from were right. Genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. By that, these folks meant that if you're going to become really, really good at anything, you got to work really, really hard. And Anders Ericsson would add, and it has to be the right kind of hard work. Not just any hard work does it. You have to work at deliberate practice. Okay, so why does it take so many years for people to become geniuses? It's because deliberate practice often requires a coach, a mentor, someone to feed you while you're training, someone to take care of you if you're a kid. And most people, especially in the athletic area, only have the capacity to train 2 to 5 hours a day. If you try to train for the marathon 10 hours a day, you're going to burn out, you're going to blow out your knees, you're going to get injured. And if you try to train at music, most people can't spend more than a few hours a day playing. Now, they could also read about music and read about music history and learn about music theory and learn to read music. But actually performing music, even most musicians don't spend more than a couple or a few hours a day because it's exhausting. You could get carpal tunnel syndrome. And so we're limited in our ability to practice many things. We're not so limited in our ability to study psychology. I work one way or another teaching psychology, learning about psychology, collecting data in psychology, probably at least 10 hours a day in a typical day, at least. Okay, so things that are more intellectual, excuse me, you can sit down and do them. If you're a person like me who absolutely loves it, you can do it for more than 2 to 5 hours a day. If it requires physical effort, like running a marathon, training for a marathon, you have to limit how much time you spend out on the street or on the treadmill. So genius is rare because very few people can put in that much time. Very few people have families who can support them financially to do that. Very few people. If I could quit my job as a psychologist and be guaranteed to have health insurance and a good income, I would consider trying to become a better sculptor. It'd be a tough call because I love both, but I can't do that. And if I wanted to work as a sculptor, right now I'd make about $10 an hour, and that won't feed my family. So real life often gets in the way. Even if you love the activity, often real life makes it hard to practice as much as you might want to. But if you're a person with a profound disability and you're lucky enough to have a caregiver who helps you feed, who helps you get food, who helps you stay safe out of the rain, you are often allowed to work many, many hours a day doing what gives you joy. And in that case, you could become very, very good at that thing, at least in an ideal environment. That's life as a savant. Okay, let me just say a little bit more. I know this lecture's gone on quite a bit, but I hope it's kept you engaged because the stories are so interesting. Let me just say a little bit more about the modularity, the insularity, the specificity of human thought and genius. I refer to this as you know what you know. If you know music, good for you. You know music. That doesn't automatically make you good at spelling or at math. We know what we know. If you look at the person who's arguably the greatest baseball hitter in history, okay, this is Ted Williams, according to most experts on baseball. We can debate whether modern players are better. There's no doubt that in his era, he was the best hitter ever. He batted over 400. He was the last person in baseball to bat more than 400, for example. An amazing hitter, Baseball Hall of Fame. He could hit just about anything. But he couldn't get a hit off Joan Joyce, who was in 1961, when Williams agreed to do a fundraiser in this little town in Connecticut in front of 17,000 people, by the way. There were lots of witnesses to this. He could not get a single hit off Joan Joyce because she was pitching softballs when he was used to hitting baseball. She pitched, I think, from 60 feet when he was used to hitting someone who pitched from 90 feet, which gave him less time to react to the movement of the ball. So to make a long story short there, the greatest hitter in baseball history, who was great at hitting baseballs, was not great, at least not immediately, at hitting softballs. If you want to look that up for yourself, look for an ESPN story called something like "The Best Ted Williams Ever Faced," and you can read in great detail about that amazing story. So that is a guy who was amazing at baseball, hitting a baseball, not so good at hitting a softball. Michael Jordan, if you ask most experts, they will agree. You know, LeBron James fans might disagree, but most experts consider Michael Jordan the best basketball player who ever lived, and I tend to side with them. I think LeBron has some skills, like being 6'8" and physically powerful, that Jordan didn't quite have, but I think I would have to agree that Jordan was probably the best basketball player who ever lived, certainly one of the greatest. How did that help in baseball? The answer is he was a decent high school baseball player. I think he played in high school. He always liked baseball. He was a good baseball player, but he never came close to becoming, to reaching the elite level performance that it would have taken for him to become a good professional baseball player. He played in the minor leagues for a year or two and then finally gave up because he just could not get to that level. So if you believe in general athletic ability, the way some people believe in general intelligence, Michael Jordan should have become a good professional baseball player, but he didn't. He got good. Okay, he was better than the average high school player, I'm guessing, by the end of his effort to be a pro. But even with all the coaching, all the effort, all the fans dying to see him become a good baseball player, he just couldn't do it. And if you look at track and field, my guess is Michael Jordan would have been a very good, maybe even a college high jumper because of his leaping ability. I don't think he would have made the Olympics. If you look at his ability to run the 800 meters, I'm guessing I could have outrun him, and I was a mediocre 800. I could run below 2 minutes. I doubt if Michael Jordan could, even in great shape. And maybe I'm wrong, but I'm just making the point that Michael Jordan was very, very good at his chosen sport. He developed extreme genius, extreme expertise there, but it didn't translate to other sports. At least it didn't necessarily translate. Speaking of baseball, if you're a baseball fan, you know this. If you're not a baseball fan, you might be confused by it. The average batting average of a major league pitcher in baseball today in 2018, a couple of years ago, remember back when we had baseball or regular baseball, was below 150 in both the American and the National Leagues. It's been in that range for the past 4 or 5 decades. There was an era in Babe Ruth's era, the 1920s, 1930s, when it was a bit better. But throughout baseball history, at the collegiate level, high school level, professional level, the very people who are amazing at pitching baseballs are terrible at hitting them. I mean, terrible. Okay, so being good at throwing a baseball and knowing all the tricks of what means that you're about to throw a curveball, a slider, a fastball, that does not make you good at hitting those balls. It's another example of the insularity of the modularity of genius. Okay, very quick story because this was a bit personal. In the late 1970s, when I was in high school, arguably the best high school athlete in the state of Georgia, the state, not the nation, not the world, was a guy I'll call Jim Thompson because I'm changing his name. He was about 6'5". I saw him at track meets. He was an amazing shot putter, an amazing discus thrower. He was even pretty quick for such a big guy. I think he ran on his high school sprint relay team. So an amazing athlete, no doubt about it. I'm pretty sure he was also a basketball standout, but I know for sure he got a Division I football scholarship to UT Knoxville, which was a very, very good football team back in those days. And he became a college standout player. He was a bit of a jerk, though. I know people who knew him, and I have it on very good authority, that in his junior or senior year at UT, when he's a college student, when he's big and famous, he started to haze the freshmen. He bullied them. He assaulted them. He decided each freshman had to be beaten up a little bit and bullied. The freshmen just put up with it because they're freshmen. He was the boss. He was the big guy on the team, and nobody, of course, wanted to fight him because, even if you're a football player, 6'5", 240-ish, and athletic with no fat on you, you're a beast. Nobody wants to fight you. But Thompson made the mistake of messing with a guy named Marshall Revis, a guy I grew up with. But so I knew Marshall pretty well because I grew up with him. He was not a huge guy. He was a big guy, about 6'1", not even 200 pounds, maybe 185, 195. He did make it to the team at UT Knoxville. He got a scholarship there, an athletic scholarship, which for my high school was a big, big deal. But of course, he sat the bench. He was not as good a football player as those other people who came from better schools with better training programs, better knowledge of football. But what Marshall Revis was really good at, and I saw this happen many times as a kid, was beating people up. So Marshall was not a bully, but if you messed with him, if you punched him, if you threatened him, if you grabbed him, you were going to get a fight and you were probably going to get your butt kicked. So this little guy, I'm calling him little because relative to Jim Thompson, he was little, in a minute or so, just beat up, I'm trying to watch my language here and say beat the stuffings out of this guy who was arguably much more athletic. The answer is simple. Marshall had two older brothers who were both very good athletes and very, very good fighters, and he fought with them all the time growing up. So if there'd been a market back then for mixed martial art fighters, I would have put some money on Marshall because he spent every day of his life, most of the time riding the bus home from school, I would see Marshall fight somebody. Well, actually for a while, because pretty quickly people realized nobody could beat him up. But I saw him fight his own brothers, his older brothers, and they would beat him up one day, he'd fight them again the next day. And nobody after a while messed with Marshall because he was not an amazing athlete. He was a good, solid athlete. He was an amazing fighter because that's what he spent thousands of hours doing as a kid, a teenager, and even, I assume, as a young man. So that's another example of the insularity of genius or skill. All right. Do any of these ideas apply to people? They do apply to people. I'm going to give you a quick example or two of that. I'm going to give you a very famous study in the history of cognitive psychology. It's a 50-year-old study now. Wason, a guy from Great Britain, did this very classic experiment with people where he told people correctly about a rule. Here's the rule. Every card contains a number on one side. That's a fact. And every card contains a letter on the other. So he put people in front of 4 cards. They're going to be labeled something like E, K, 4, and 7. Your job is to figure out whether a rule is true. Here's the rule. Every vowel must have an even number on the other side. Oh, I see. So the cards have numbers on one side. Those numbers can be even or odd. They have letters on the other side. Those letters could be vowels or that's a fact. Every card has a number one side, a letter on the other. And so you have to test the rule. Every vowel must have an even number on the other side. Now to make this quick and to make it easier than it is when Wason gave it, I'm going to give you a clue. You want to turn over the smallest number of cards possible to test the rule. That's what Wason told people. But I'm going to tell you, you only need to turn over 2. Some people just turn over 1 card and think they're done. Some people turn over all 4 cards. You don't need to. You just need to turn over 2 cards. The question is which 2 to test the rule. Here it is again. Every vowel must have an even number on the other side. All right. Every vowel must have an even number on the other side. Which 2 cards would you turn over? I want you to do it pretty quickly to decide if that rule is correct, it's true, or it's incorrect, it's not true. All right. I'll give you 10 seconds to think about that and do it. Every vowel must have an even number on the other side. All right, now I'm rushing to bed. You might like a little bit more time, but I'll tell you, when I did this, I saw this problem decades ago. I did it just like that. Like in a split second, I answer the question, and I'll give you my answer as I remember it. I think it was even those exact cards, except they were physical cards on a chalkboard. So I turned over the E, and okay, I turned it over. Every vowel must have an even number. So far, so good. I turned over the 4, and you're going to see that here, I hope. Yep. And it has an A. I'm done. I turned over 2 cards. Yes, the rule is true. My conclusion is, yes, the rule is correct. As it turns out, I was incorrect, and my academic advisor in graduate school was laughing at me, as he loved to do, because he was sort of a prankster. But there was a point behind his prank. His point was this kid who thought he was very witty and smart and ingenious made an obvious mistake, and I'll show you that mistake here. If you look at the EK47 problem again, I'm going to show you what I should have done but did not do. Here's what I should have done. I should have flipped over the E, because it says every vowel, E is a vowel, must have an even number. You got to check that out. But what I neglected to do was the other important thing, which is to turn over the 7. And when you turn over the 7, you see that U is definitely a vowel. And unless you round 7 up to 8, which you're not allowed to do, every vowel in this set of cards does not have an even number on the other side. So I drew the wrong logical conclusion. I'd had 2 college courses in logic by this point. I should have known better. I didn't. And of course, my advisor, Bill Swan, quickly reminded me correctly, because he knew about the problem, that I didn't need to turn over the 4, because the rule did not say that consonants can't have an even number. It said that vowels have to. So I blew the problem. I got it wrong. He made fun of me, made some joke about whether I should maybe consider a career shoveling horse poop instead of being a psychologist, but that was all in good fun. The point is, at this abstract thinking task, I failed miserably. Most people fail miserably. Every once in a while, a person gets it right, and my guess is that person got some specific training in logic and problem solving that the rest of us didn't get. I don't think it's a great indicator of IQ. I can show you, by the way, that you could give this logical puzzle to a person any place on the planet Earth. As long as they knew what candy is, and as long as they knew what payment is, they would get a cousin of this problem, a logically identical version of the problem, absolutely correct. So dozens of studies have now been done since the early to mid 1980s. So for decades now, people have shown over and over and over again that if you give people the abstract version of that problem with A's and E's and K's and 4's and 3's and 8's, the typical person performs terribly. They fall prey to what's called the positive test bias. They look for what they expect to see. But if you give people a concrete version that, according to Tooby and Cosmides, allows them to use what they consider a cheater detection rule. They think this is an evolved cheater detection rule that lets people detect cheaters. It's very important to know if other people are cheating you. We human beings evolved to be really good at the specific problem of detecting cheaters, even though we're not good abstract general purpose reasoners. And so when they give people, whether it's little kids or college students or 80-year-old adults, or whether it's people in tribes, it's been studied in multiple tribes of hunter-gatherers who don't have written language, no formal education whatsoever. But if you give them the problem and you represent it for them, and they have to do that same activity, if the kid took a piece of candy, she must have paid for it. Here's another version. If the person is drinking an alcoholic beverage, they better be more than 21 years of age. It's okay to be 23 and not be drinking an alcoholic beverage, but if you're drinking an alcoholic beverage, you better be 21 years of age, or you're going to get kicked out, and the bouncer is going to get in trouble, and the person running the bar is going to get in trouble. So if you give people questions like this, which are logically identical, in fact, they're a bit more complicated, you could argue, logically identical to the original EK47 activity, people do incredibly well. And so instead of going through that in more detail, I'll just show you. If you tell people, test the rule that anyone who took candy must have paid for it, and these are the cards. One side tells you if the person took candy or didn't. The other side tells you if they paid or did not. It's just like that other abstract problem. You see that virtually everybody, 90–95% of people, whether it's in Canada or the United Kingdom or Papua New Guinea, they get the problem correct. They recognize you got to see if she paid because she took candy, and you have to see if she took candy because she didn't pay, and she did take the candy, she didn't pay, so she broke the rule. The rule has been broken. In this case, if you make it concrete and you make it relevant to something that we all evolved to be good at, people are very, very good at it. Okay, so that's an example of the modularity of careful thinking, the modularity of genius. We are not general purpose problem solvers. We're not general purpose reasoners. We're very, very good at some specific things. We're great at language. We're not always so good at conservation. And IQ is not just one thing. This little cartoon illustrates that for you. I'll let you read it for yourself. I think I would spoil a joke if I explained it, so if you need to pause, you can. Otherwise, I hope you get why that cartoon is an illustration of the fact that people can be brilliant and figure out one thing, but you change the problem just a little bit, and suddenly they're not so brilliant. All right, that's that. Let me share with you one of my favorite examples of modular thinking. Limited thinking, a person who's great at thinking in one context, but you change the problem just a little bit, and the person's not so good. Now, I'm poking fun not just of the character in this show, but in a sense, I'm poking fun of everybody, because a PhD in psychology and does clinical psychology also applies to people who do social psychology, by the way, because research shows that people who do marital therapy and people who study close relationships don't do a better job than other people of having good relationships on average. So clinical psychologists who do relationship therapy have the same divorce rate, or maybe a slightly higher divorce rate, than people with equivalent levels of education in, let's say, medicine or accounting or law, for example. So people with PhDs in clinical psychology who make their living doing very good work at helping other people save their marriages are not any better than other people at saving their own marriages. They're good at helping other people. They're not so good at helping themselves. And in this little clip, I'm going to share with you Tobias, who, by the way, is not such a great psychotherapist. We're going to forgive that detail. He points out to his wife that people often try this thing called open relationships, and it just doesn't work. If they try to open up their relationships, have an open marriage, time after time after time, Tobias has found that that leads to failure. All right, my technology is fighting me, but I'm not going to let it win. This is that clip. It's very hard for me to start it right at the beginning, but I'm very close there. So Tobias, the guy you see on your right, that's his wife. They're having a conversation about whether they should consider having an open marriage, and he's going to make the point that he's tried this with patient after patient, and it just doesn't work. They get jealous, things go wrong. Then you're going to see the conclusion he draws from that.
Well, did it work for those people?
No, it never does. I mean, these people somehow delude themselves into thinking it might, but it might work for us.
So my apologies if you couldn't hear that very well, and I couldn't get any subtitles. I don't know that well, but the point that he made to his wife was it might work for us, something that never worked for other people, that he should have known wouldn't work for him. He thought it might work for them, and in fact, if you've ever watched that series, you know it did not work for them. It didn't make their relationship better. It was a failure. It was an example of the insularity, the modularity of human thinking. People who are great at one thing aren't so great at that activity. When you tweak the problem or change the problem just a little bit, suddenly they're just like the rest of us, or maybe even worse. All right, so that's that. Okay, other quick pieces of evidence that IQ is malleable, or that it's not just one thing. There's something called the Flynn effect. It's a very well documented effect. Now, we've known about it for about 40 years, going on 40 years. It's the fact that every decade in nations across the globe, some nations more so, other nations a bit less so, but across the globe, IQ is going up about 3 points a decade. So every decade, people take IQ tests, and the IQ test scores don't go up because they keep changing the rules of the test to make it harder to get 100, harder to get a 140. But if you look at absolute performance, how many questions that we give today did people get right 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago? If you look at absolute performance on IQ tests, people are getting better. And it's not because the answers are out there in some giant test bank. People are just getting smarter. People have looked at this effect in lots of different ways. And of course, that's caused by environmental forces. It's not the case that every decade the gene pool of human beings is getting intellectually superior. When you see in the course of 50 years, okay, 50 years, a 1 standard deviation increase in IQ, that's a radical increase in 50 years. Evolution doesn't happen that fast, okay? So the Flynn effect is a dramatic example. of the fact that environmental forces affect IQ scores and environmental forces shouldn't. If IQ tests measure your true raw ability, they should not be picking up on environmental forces, but they do. They also pick up a lot on schooling and a massive natural experiment of millions of people in Norway that was based on the fact that for kids born in the early to mid 1950s, Norway changed the law so that those kids had to get extra years of schooling beginning in what we call middle school and high school. So as a function of laws that were passed in Norway, a group of kids who would have, let's say, stopped schooling at 9 or 10 years went to get additional schooling. And for every extra year of education that young teenagers got, they didn't get that extra schooling until they were 13, 14 years of age. That bumped up their IQ by about 5 points. The reason that study is important is there's a massive correlation between IQ and education, but we never knew, is it that smart kids want to get an education and are good at it, or is it that education actually boosts your IQ? Now we know that second option is the case. Getting more education as a manipulation, regardless of your aptitude or your liking for school or your level of genius, getting education increases IQ. That's a causal statement based on a natural experiment that we couldn't make until the last decade or two when that clever study came out. Now, it is also the case, if you believe in IQ, that high IQ kids probably like learning more. But even if you accept that, and I'm not sure if I do, it's also clearly the case that if you get more education, that dramatically increases your IQ. Thirdly, IQ tests, even the people who take traditional approaches to IQ and look at IQ tests as they've been given for decades, people look at the WAIS, the WAIS, for example, they've begun to recognize to an increasing degree, I think decade by decade, that modern IQ tests like the WAIS, for example, measure at least 5, maybe 6, some people say 7 distinct things. So from verbal memory to verbal reasoning to visual reasoning to raw processing speed, IQ tests don't measure one thing, they measure multiple things. There's still some debate and controversy about that. There's still people who believe in G, there are a lot of them, but from my perspective, the evidence for G is pretty weak and the evidence against it is pretty strong. So those are some references for those three, those are some citations for those 3 comments, by the way. If Spearman was wrong then, in my view, and not everybody agrees with me, and IQ is not really just one thing, what is it? According to Howard Gardner, intelligence is at least 8 very different things. And you probably heard of this theory if you took a course in high school in psychology, because it's very popular. Experts in IQ have been very, very critical of his theory. Let me make that clear. I'm a bigger fan of his theory than most people certainly people who study IQ for a living. And their argument is, he's got this clever, fancy idea that there are at least 8 ways that you can be smart, but he doesn't have good measures of his 8 forms of IQ. And they're right, he does not have good measures of this. So his measure for how body smart you are, or how music smart you are, or how self-smart you are, is to ask you questions that you answer. Yeah, I'm good at that. Yes, I can whistle a tune easily without needing to have the music. Yes, I'm very athletic. Yes, I'm very coordinated. His measure is basically a self-report measure. That's a big drawback of the measure. The thing I think is a problem, the problematic issue with that critique is Howard Gardner does not have billions of dollars to invest in measurement the way companies have over the past 100 years, who make their living charging people to take IQ tests. So the IQ test business, whether it's an IQ test per se, or it's the SAT or the LSAT or the MCAT or the GRE, those are multi-million and multi-billion dollar businesses that make lots of money. Of course, they've developed great measures of what they have that are actually more objective. You actually have to prove to me that you can do math by solving equations. Of course, those folks can do that with their many, many million-dollar budgets. But to critique Gardner on that point in principle is, to me, a pretty weak critique. The critics are right. He has not yet gathered much data. We need data to really document this, but it's logically clear to me, just from careful observation and case studies like the ones that I showed you, that there are lots and lots and lots of people who have very, very sophisticated physical skills. They are body smart, and that doesn't guarantee that they're good at logic. There are people who are great authors and writers who hate mathematics. There are people who are people smart who aren't self-smart. And there have been many people in my life who are people smart because they have PhDs in psychology. That doesn't always give them great insight into their own psychological processing. And many people have accused me of being that same way, making bad decisions, even though I know better. Okay, so that is the idea. I considered a conceptual critique of research on IQ, even though at this point there aren't a lot. I'll admit that there aren't a lot of great data behind it yet. We'll see what happens down the road. Okay, conclusion. It's not very useful to think of IQ as if it were a single thing, even a single thing like athletic ability. We could even argue about whether that, body smart, athletic ability is really a form of IQ. Let's say you don't think it's a form of IQ, and you think, no, athletic ability is distinct from IQ. Athletic ability is the ability to be good at lots of sports and games, and it's an ability, but it's not intelligence. Okay, well, let's just stop right there. If you think that athletic ability is just one thing, you have to face the fact that if you measure different aspects of athletic ability, whether you do it formally or in this case study I'll share with you here, athletic ability is actually many different things, some of which are negatively correlated with one another. And the quick example I'll give you here is just some that I rattled off just by thinking. I've always liked sports and games, not nearly as much as my more athletic brothers, but I've always liked sports and none of my sisters like sports and games that much. But if you take me as a man who was in my late 20s or early 30s, this is where I would rate myself. These are self-ratings. Some people might disagree. This is where I would rate myself on these different aspects of athletic ability. I would rate myself as way above average in upper body strength. I placed in the California State and U.S. National Strict Curl competition. When I was a young man, I could strictly, carefully, by legal standards of an athletic competition, I could curl my body weight. So when I weighed about 170, I could curl about 170. Okay, so in that area, very strong. Now, I wasn't as good at the bench press, but I was very good at that one. My leg strength was better than my upper body strength. So when I was in college on a mediocre track team, it annoyed the shot putters and javelin throwers and discus throwers on my team that I, as a guy who weighed 165 back then, could squat more weight than they could. Okay, I could squat 500 pounds and none of them could, and it drove them crazy. Okay, so that was leg strength. I'm off the charts on that one. But if you look at other aspects of athletic ability that are just as important, more important for some sports, I have sucky body awareness. I was a crappy wrestler in high school. To make a long story short, I quit after a year because I wasn't that good. And one of the reasons I wasn't that good is I just didn't have good body awareness. Could I have developed it? I don't know, ask Kay Anders Erickson, but I also didn't like wrestling that much, so I dropped out. I'm even worse at throwing speed than I am at body awareness. So when I took my 11-year-old nephew, something like 17 years ago, when he was 11, he's pushing 30 now. When I took my nephew to the Baseball Hall of Fame at the age of 11, I was in my mid to late 30s. I was physically very strong at that point. I was very healthy. We did an activity where you threw a baseball and they put you on radar. And back then, 15, 20 years ago, to be on radar was really cool. Justin went first, and I think he threw about 55 miles an hour, which for a kid who's 11 is pretty darn good. Now, he's a kid. He hasn't even reached puberty yet. He threw a baseball 55 miles an hour. I never thought of myself as great at throwing things, but I thought just based on my sheer physical strength and size, I'll throw much faster. I'll throw in the 60s, something like that. I don't remember my exact speed, but I think it was 43. It was in the 40s. He was well above me. The fastest I could throw a baseball at age, let's say 35, when I was physically much, much stronger than Justin, was I could throw it about 43 miles an hour. That was my top speed. That is terrible. It's not average. It's way, way, way below average. And there's an area, I'm putting this one in here tongue in cheek, where I'm even worse than that. So as crappy as my throwing speed is, my swimming ability is even worse. Now the scale only stops at 0, but I put a -10 in here to emphasize the fact that I've never in my life met a person who could swim at all who was worse at swimming than I am. Now, when I was young and I took a swimming class in college, I barely made it through the class. I did get my A because it was sort of based on your starting point. My starting point was horrible, but I was by far the worst swimmer in the course. And in fact, once I learned to swim and I could swim safely, I said, okay, I'm going to enter a couple of triathlons. I entered triathlons. I did the biking, the running, and the swimming. And the last triathlon I did, I finished in the top 2 in biking, the top 3 in running out of about 100 people, and I came in last place, not 50th, not last. Out of 100 other people, everybody beat me because it took me about half an hour to swim what it took the other swimmers about 9 minutes. It was 800 meters. They could swim it in about 9 minutes. Some of the slow ones were 10 minutes, 11 minutes, 12 minutes. I was beyond 30 minutes. So that's an example of a person who I think is arguably pretty good at some things and terrible at other things. Whether that's because of Kay Anders Erickson, whether I just don't have that athletic talent, we could debate that all day. But even athletic ability is many, many different things. IQ is not just one thing. And I think that's it, but let's see. Yep, that's it. So thank you for staying with me for this long lecture. If you have to take a break in the middle, I won't blame you. But thank you for listening to this lengthy lecture on the myth of G, or the myth of general IQ.